My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 42 years old, and I work as a librarian in a small coastal town not far from where I grew up. Life these days is quiet, filled mostly with morning walks to the coffee shop and long evenings spent tucked into worn novels. It's a good life, though not a loud one. I think I've come to prefer the quiet. A few weeks ago, I found myself seated in a stuffy law office downtown. Thick oak shelves lined the walls, filled with books I doubted anyone had touched in decades. The room smelled faintly of leather and old paper. We were there for my mother's will reading. I sat near the back, a little apart from the others, my brother, my two cousins, a couple of family friends. They clustered together like they always did, whispering among themselves, shooting me those small, sharp glances they thought I wouldn't notice. When the lawyer called my name at the beginning of the proceedings, there was a ripple across the room. I caught the way my brother's eyes flicked upward in a barely concealed roll, the way one of my cousins smirked into her hand as if something about my presence was funny. It was subtle. It always was. The kind of slight that left no fingerprints, but still pressed down heavily on your heart. I sat there quietly, smoothing the hem of my skirt, trying not to let the familiarity of it all sink too deep. Even here, even now, after everything, it seemed I was still the outsider. Still the one who didn't quite belong. The lawyer cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, preparing to begin. I folded my hands in my lap and braced myself for whatever was about to come, feeling the old ache settle in my chest like an unwelcome guest I'd almost grown used to. Growing up, our house always felt a little too quiet for the number of people. Inside it, conversations skimmed the surface, politeness masking deeper tensions that no one dared acknowledge. My mother, Evelyn, was the axis we all quietly spun around. She had a way of commanding a room without ever raising her voice. She loved us all. I believe that even now. But there were invisible lines drawn between each of us, subtle distinctions that colored everything. My older brother, Daniel, was the golden child from the beginning. Where I brought home messy art projects and half-finished stories, Daniel brought home trophies, certificates, and perfectly recited speeches. He was charming in the way that won over teachers, neighbors, and distant relatives at family gatherings. No matter what I did, it always seemed to pale beside him. When I got an A in English, it was barely mentioned at dinner. When Daniel won a regional science fair, my mother baked a cake and invited the neighbors. At birthdays, the differences grew. More obvious. Daniel would unwrap new bikes, stereo sets, and designer jackets. My gifts were practical: a set of notebooks, a sturdy backpack. Things I needed, but not the things a little girl dreams of. As we got older, the gap didn't close. At family reunions, I was the one asked to set the tables or watch the younger cousins, while Daniel was paraded around, introduced with pride to every new guest. I learned early not to expect too much. I became self-sufficient without really noticing. I paid for my own college classes by working evenings at a bookstore, while Daniel had his tuition covered without a second thought. I bought my first car, a battered old sedan, with savings, from 3 part-time jobs. Daniel's first car had been a brand new silver hatchback, a graduation gift from our parents. And yet, despite the constant, quiet dismissals, I never let the bitterness take root. I told myself that being invisible had its freedoms, that I could build my own life without the weight of anyone's expectations pressing down on me. Still, there were moments, small, rare ones, when my mother's mask would slip. Once, late at night, I came home from my campus job and found her sitting at the kitchen table, her tea untouched and growing cold. She looked up at me with an expression I didn't see often, soft, unguarded. "You're doing good things, Claire," she said quietly, almost as if she didn't want the walls to hear. "I notice. Even if I don't always say it." It wasn't much. But for me, it was enough to tuck away in my heart, A private reassurance that maybe, somewhere deep beneath the roles we had all been assigned, she saw me for who I really was. There were other small affirmations, too. A handwritten note slipped into my lunchbox during finals week. Proud of you. A pair of worn gardening gloves passed down to me, her own, not new, when I said I wanted to start a tiny balcony garden in my apartment. Not grand gestures, not things the others would even notice. But for me, they spoke volumes. Of course, to the outside world, and especially to the rest of the family, I remained the afterthought. At Christmas, Daniel's gifts would sparkle under the tree while mine were functional. During family conversations, my opinions were brushed aside with a smile or a change of topic. I wasn't rebellious enough to fight it, nor naive enough to believe I could change it. Instead, I carved out a quiet place for myself. A small life built on my own terms. A modest apartment, a job I loved, a handful of close friends who knew the real me. And in all that time, I never asked for anything from my family. Note approved, no attention, not even acknowledgement. I told myself that being seen was overrated. The need for anyone's validation made you weak. But some days, when I was honest with myself, I felt the weight of it. The silent rejection. The knowledge that no matter how kind, or competent or loyal I was, it would never be enough to break through whatever invisible wall had been built around me when I was too young to understand. When my mother passed away, I grieved her in my own way, quietly, deeply. I miss the mother she could have been, not just the one she was. And as the days passed, and my brother and the others gathered without me to make arrangements and whisper about inheritances, I stayed where I had always been, on the outskirts. Looking in, I didn't expect much from the will reading. Maybe a keepsake, a framed photograph, an old recipe book. Certainly not a place at the table where decisions were made. Certainly not anything that would shift the balance that had always been so carefully maintained. As I sat in that heavy, somber room, watching Daniel lean back in his chair with a smirk and my cousins trade knowing glances, I reminded myself, you expect nothing. You take nothing personally. You survive. It was a lesson I had learned a long, long time ago. After my mother passed away, the silence from my family grew heavier. Not the kind of heavy that demands attention, but the kind that settles into every corner until it's just part of the landscape. I wasn't invited to help plan the funeral arrangements. Daniel handled everything, or so I heard from a neighbor who mentioned the service details almost by accident. There was no group message, no call to discuss Mom's favorite hymns or the readings she would have wanted. Just decisions made. Tasks, delegated, and a quiet expectation that I would show up, sit in the back, and not cause any complications. And that's exactly what I did. At the funeral, I sat alone in the third pew while Daniel stood at the front, delivering a eulogy about devotion and family unity. The words fell hollow against the polished wood and high, stained glass windows. He spoke of loyalty, of sacrifice, of bonds that could never be broken, all while refusing to meet my eyes even once. Afterward, when the family gathered at Daniel's house, I wasn't invited there either. I went home, changed into a worn sweater, and sat on my small balcony, staring at the potted herbs my mother had once encouraged me to grow. Days turned into weeks. I caught glimpses of gatherings and photos posted by cousins. Dinners, group walks by the bay, laughter shared over wine, and long tables filled with food. Not once was I called, messaged, or even tagged. It didn't shock me. It stung, certainly. But after so many years of being on the outside looking in, I knew how to nurse that sting without letting it fester. Still, there was a coldness to it this time. A deliberateness that hadn't always been there before. It wasn't just forgetfulness. It was exclusion. When the letter arrived, summoning me to the lawyer's office for the reading of my mother's will, I almost didn't open it right away. It sat on my kitchen counter for a full day, its heavy cream envelope an awkward presence against the clutter of my normal life. Some part of me knew. Whatever this meeting contained, it wasn't likely to be in my favor. The morning of the will reading, I chose my outfit carefully. Simple, respectful. Gray slacks, a navy blouse, flats. Nothing to make a statement. Nothing that could be mistaken for arrogance or expectation. The law office was just a few blocks from the center of town, tucked between a florist and a coffee shop I used to visit with my mother. It was the kind of place you might walk past 100 times without ever really noticing. Inside, the receptionist led me to a conference room where Daniel and my cousins were already gathered. They barely looked up when I entered. A few raised eyebrows, a whispered comment I couldn't catch, a quick exchange of smirks between Daniel and my cousin Laura. I chose a seat at the far end of the table, close enough to hear but far enough to give them the distance they clearly wanted. The lawyer, a thin, gray-haired man named Mr. Saunders, shuffled papers at the head of the table. He cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began reading the formalities: acknowledgement of the will, validation of witnesses, verification of heirs. Daniel leaned back in his chair, legs stretched out comfortably, fingers tapping absently against the armrest. His posture spoke volumes. He was sure of his place, sure of what was coming. I kept my hands folded tightly in my lap, eyes on the polished surface of the table, tracing invisible lines in the wood grain. Mr. Saunders read through the standard distributions first. A small trust left to a charity, some jewelry allocated to a distant aunt, a few sentimental items noted for old family friends. Daniel's name came up early. He was given access to a sizable savings account and ownership of the summer house by the lake. Laura and her sister received valuable antique furniture and a portion of a mutual fund. Each time their names were mentioned, there were satisfied nods, glances exchanged like secret handshakes. The air thickened with entitlement. When Mr. Saunders paused briefly, flipping to a new page in the stack, a ripple of impatience moved through the room. It was clear, to them at least, that everything had gone exactly as expected. And then the lawyer's voice shifted slightly. A new tone, measured, careful. He cleared his throat again and said, "There is an additional addendum to the will, handwritten and notarized 6 months prior to Mrs. Bennet's passing. It pertains specifically to Claire." There was a visible reaction around the table. Daniel's tapping stopped. Laura leaned forward, eyes narrowing slightly. I kept my face still, but inside something twisted. It wasn't hope exactly, more like the sharp, almost painful flutter of being acknowledged at all. Mr. Saunders continued, "Per the addendum, certain additional assets and instructions are to be disclosed separately." For a moment, no one spoke. The room, already heavy, with unspoken tensions, seemed to draw in a collective breath. I could feel their eyes on me now, assessing, suspicious, disbelieving. As if I had somehow orchestrated this. As if my very presence there was a threat to what they had already considered theirs. The table's polished surface blurred slightly as I fought to stay centered. It wasn't about money. It was about being remembered, being seen, being trusted with something that mattered. Mr. Saunders methodically set the stack of papers aside and pulled out a thin manila envelope, marked with my mother's handwriting. Recognized it immediately. The slight leftward tilt, the careful loops on her G's and Y's. My heart thudded once, hard, against my ribs. Whatever was inside that envelope, it wasn't just about possessions. It was about something more, something they had never believed I was worthy of. And somehow, even before the contents were revealed, I knew. Nothing in my family would ever look the same again. There's a memory I return to more often than I care to admit. It happened years ago, on a night that didn't seem particularly special at the time. One of those ordinary moments that only later reveals itself as something you carry with you forever. I was 24, home for a rare visit during a break between jobs. It was late, well past midnight, and the house was wrapped in that particular kind of quiet that only falls when everyone else is deeply asleep. I couldn't sleep. The walls felt thinner somehow, the air thicker. I found myself wandering downstairs to the kitchen, hoping a cup of tea would settle the restlessness humming under my skin. The kitchen light was already on. My mother was sitting at the table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, staring out the window into the dark. She didn't turn when I entered, just lifted one hand slightly, a wordless invitation to sit. I poured myself a cup, then slid into the seat across from her. We sat in silence for a long time, the kind that wasn't awkward but oddly comforting, as if the quiet itself was its own kind of conversation. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft and raw around the edges. "I know you think I don't see you." "Claire," she said, still not meeting my eyes. "And maybe I haven't shown it the way I should have." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure I trusted my voice. She took a slow sip of her tea before setting it down carefully, as if stalling for time. "Your brother, the others, they always needed so much. Attention, reassurance, applause. I guess I got used to giving it." There was no bitterness in her tone, just a weary sort of acknowledgement. "But you—" She finally looked at me then, really looked, and I felt my throat tighten. "You never asked for anything. You just carried yourself through, no matter." "What?" The words hung between us, fragile and enormous all at once. "I thought," she continued, "that by not fussing over you, I was giving you space. I thought I was showing respect. But now I wonder if all I showed you was distance." She reached into the pocket of her cardigan then and pulled out a small, battered envelope. She slid it across the table toward me without a word. I picked it up cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of folded paper, a note written in her familiar looping script. It wasn't long, just a few lines. "Claire, you are stronger than you know, more capable than anyone has ever given you credit for, including me. You don't need my approval, but you have my admiration. Always. Mom." I stared down at the words, the ink slightly smudged at the edges, and felt something shift inside me. Not a grand, cinematic moment of healing. Something quieter. A knot. Loosening. A breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding for years finally let out into the night. I didn't cry. I didn't fling myself into her arms. We were not that kind of family. Instead, I folded the note carefully, tucked it back into the envelope, and slipped it into my pocket. "Thank you," I said simply. She nodded once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. Then she turned her gaze back, to the dark window, and I sat with her a little longer, both of us wrapped in a silence that felt heavier, but somehow also kinder. After that night, nothing much changed outwardly. The same dynamics played out at family events, the same patterns of being overlooked, minimized, sidestepped. But inside, something was different. I carried that note with me for years, tucked into the inner lining of my wallet, folded and refolded until the paper began to soften and wear thin. On hard days, when the loneliness pressed in a little too tightly, I would take it out, run my fingers over the familiar loops of her handwriting, and remind myself I was seen. Maybe not publicly, maybe not in ways that others understood or respected, but somewhere, in the quiet heart of the woman who had shaped so much of my world, I was seen. And maybe, just maybe, I was loved not despite my independence, but because of it. It wasn't validation I needed. It never had been. It was the quiet. Recognition that sometimes strength looks like standing alone, not out of rebellion, but out of a quiet, stubborn kind of hope. I thought about that night now, sitting in the lawyer's office, the weight of the envelope bearing my mother's handwriting in front of me. Whatever was inside, whatever decisions she had made, I realized it didn't change who I was. It didn't rewrite the years of being pushed aside, or the ache of not being fully claimed, but it meant something. It meant she had thought about it, about me, about what was fair and what was right, even when it was easier to go along with what everyone else expected. It meant I hadn't been invisible after all. The moment stretched longer than it should have. A tight, brittle silence filling the key room as Mr. Saunders held the envelope in his hands. I could feel my brother's stare burning into me from across the table. Laura shifted noisily in her chair, arms crossed, her body tense and expectant. Mr. Saunders finally broke the silence, carefully opening the envelope and unfolding the single sheet inside. He adjusted his glasses again, more slowly this time, as if weighing each word before speaking. In her final handwritten addendum, he began, voice steady, Evelyn Bennett expressed specific wishes regarding the distribution of her personal and financial assets. These instructions supersede any prior general divisions of property. There was a sharp intake of breath. Whether from Daniel or one of the cousins, I couldn't tell. Mr. Saunders continued, reading directly from my mother's own words. To my daughter Claire, for your strength, your kindness, and your loyalty in the face of silence, for seeing me when others only demanded from me. I leave you the family home at 28 Willow Lane, the entirety of my personal savings account, and all personal belongings of sentimental value. The words hit the room like a slow-moving wave. There wasn't a sound for a long moment. Then, chaos. What? Daniel barked, pushing back his chair so roughly that it scraped against the hardwood floor with a harsh screech. That's not right. She would never, Laura jumped in, her voice high and sharp. There's no way she meant everything sentimental. She promised me her jewelry, the pearls. Another cousin muttered angrily under their breath, and the room broke into overlapping accusations and disbelief. I stayed still. I didn't flinch. I sat there, hands loosely folded in my lap, watching the eruption as if from behind glass. Detached. Calm. Not victorious. Just still. Mr. Saunders lifted a hand for quiet, but it took a few moments for the shouting to dwindle into mutters and glares. There is more, he said firmly. He flipped to a notarized document attached to the addendum, and his voice took on an undeniable authority. Mrs. Bennett explicitly instructed that this transfer be executed immediately and irrevocably, with protective clauses preventing any contestation. Legal challenges to the addendum are preemptively waived by all parties, as agreed upon in the original will acceptance clause you each signed prior to today's reading. The blood drained from Daniel's face. I saw it happen. The realization, hitting him like a slow, sinking stone. She tricked us, Laura spat, turning her fury toward Mr. Saunders, as though he were somehow responsible. No, I said, my voice even and quiet. Everyone turned to look at me, as if they'd forgotten I was there, as if I were some artifact suddenly come to life. I looked each of them in the eye, one by one, not challenging, just steady. She didn't trick anyone, I said, folding my hands, on the table. She gave what she wanted to give, to whom she wanted to give it to. Daniel's hands curled into fists on the table. You don't deserve it, he growled. You were never even around. You barely even... I didn't ask for anything. I interrupted, still calm. I never asked for your approval, or your attention, or any piece of this family's spotlight. I let my gaze rest on my brother, not with anger, but with something deeper, a weary kind of sadness. I was there when it mattered, I said simply. Not in the ways you wanted, but in the ways that counted. For a moment, no one spoke. The anger, the entitlement, the rehearsed indignation, it all had nowhere to go, because deep down, they knew it was true. Mr. Saunders shuffled his papers again and began outlining the next legal steps, but I barely heard him. My focus was inward, on the steady drum of my own heartbeat, the strange, quiet relief settling in my chest. Daniel tried one last time. "This isn't fair," he said, almost to himself, his voice brittle. "She loved all of us. She would have wanted—" He cut himself off, realizing, maybe for the first time, that what he wanted and what my mother wanted were not, in the end, the same thing. I stood up slowly, smoothing down the hem of my blouse. The room seemed smaller now, cramped, airless. "I'm not staying for whatever happens next," I said, meeting Mr. Saunders' eyes, who gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of understanding. "I trust you'll handle the paperwork." Without looking back at Daniel or the others, I picked up my bag and left the room, the sound of the door clicking softly shut behind me the only punctuation needed. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt free. Free from chasing something that was never mine to begin with. Free from a table I was never truly welcome at. Outside, the afternoon sun was low and golden, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I stood there for a moment, letting the warmth sink into my skin. Then I took a deep, steady breath, turned toward home, and started walking. The room seemed to grow smaller as Mr. Saunders opened the envelope bearing my mother's handwriting. There was a carefulness to his movements, a gravity that commanded attention even among those who, moments before, had been barely disguising their boredom. He pulled out a set of documents, neatly clipped together, and adjusted his glasses again, before speaking. "In this addendum," he began, "Mrs. Bennet specifies a redistribution of her primary estate holdings." There was a noticeable shift in the air. The faint sounds of tapping fingers, casual throat clearing, even a poorly concealed yawn, all of it ceased. Daniel sat up straighter, his jaw tightening. Laura exchanged a wary glance with her sister. Mr. Saunders continued, reading directly from my mother's letter. "It is my wish that my primary residence, along with the associated property, savings accounts, and personal family heirlooms, be transferred solely and entirely to my daughter, Claire Bennet. This decision is made in recognition of her loyalty, integrity, and quiet strength, which have often gone unseen but never unnoticed by me." Silence. Dense, suffocating silence. I sat very still, the words barely registering at first. It was as though the room itself had tilted slightly, the ground shifting beneath my chair while everyone else struggled to process what they had just heard. Then, inevitably, the reactions began. Laura was the first to speak, a short, disbelieving laugh that broke from her throat like a bark. "That can't be right," she said, voice brittle. "There must be some mistake." Daniel leaned forward aggressively, his hands pressed flat against the table. "I think we all know Mom wasn't in her right mind those last few months," he said tightly, his eyes darting toward Mr. Saunders, searching for an opening, a loophole. "This isn't fair. It's not what she would have wanted." Mr. Saunders remained unflappable. "The addendum was signed, witnessed, and notarized 6 months before Mrs. Bennet's passing," he said evenly. "It was filed legally, and its instructions are binding." The murmurs around the table grew louder. Accusations, whispered threats, frantic speculation. Through it all, I sat silently, feeling strangely detached, as if I were watching a storm unfold through a thick pane of glass. I didn't gloat. I didn't argue. I simply sat with the knowledge that, for once, I had not been overlooked. For once, the quiet work of living with dignity and kindness had been seen and honored. Daniel turned his anger toward me then, his voice sharp and slicing. "Did you manipulate her? Was that it? Get her when she was vulnerable? Fill her head with lies?" I met his gaze calmly. "I didn't ask for anything," I said, my voice steady. "And I don't need to explain myself to you. It was the truth. I hadn't even known about the addendum I had walked into that room expecting to be forgotten yet again, but my mother, in her quiet, private way, had chosen something different. Mr. Saunders cleared his throat again, commanding attention once more. "I would also like to point out," he said, "that Mrs. Bennet took additional legal precautions. The assets listed in the addendum have been placed in an irrevocable trust in Claire's name. Challenges to the will or the addendum have been expressly preempted by no contest clauses. Any party that contests will forfeit their inheritance." A stunned hush fell over the room. The ramifications were immediate and brutal. To challenge the addendum meant risking everything they had already been given: Daniel's precious lake house, Laura's antique furniture, the carefully parceled shares of the savings account. Their greed clashed violently with their outrage, leaving them paralyzed, furious, but ultimately powerless. Daniel sat back heavily in his chair, his mouth a hard, angry line. Laura crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her face flushed and rigid. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Finally, I pushed my chair back from the table with a soft scrape against the polished floor. I rose slowly, gathering my things. Before I left, I let my gaze sweep the room one last time. "I didn't need anything from you," I said quietly, my voice reaching only the ears it was meant for. "I never did. But your cruelty, your exclusion, spoke louder than anything I could have said. And now, so does this." I didn't wait for a response. I didn't need one. Some battles aren't fought with shouts or slammed doors. Some victories aren't celebrated with cheers. Sometimes the deepest kind of justice comes not from winning loudly, but from standing quietly in the truth of who you are, and knowing, finally, that it's enough. As I walked out of the office, the sun was bright and blinding after the dimness of the conference room. I blinked into the light, feeling the unfamiliar weight of possibility settle onto my shoulders. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't carrying disappointment or resentment or the desperate ache of wanting to be chosen. I was carrying something lighter, something stronger. I was carrying myself. The next few weeks passed in a haze of paperwork, meetings, and quiet, necessary goodbyes. Taking ownership of the house wasn't the triumphant milestone most of my family probably imagined it would be. It wasn't a prize. It was a responsibility, and in some ways, a final, delicate gift. I moved into the house not long after the will was finalized. It was strange at first, stepping into the familiar rooms with no one else there. The walls still smelled faintly of my mother's lavender soap. The creak in the third stair still sang underfoot. The kitchen drawers still held her neatly labeled jars and mismatched mugs. But it was quiet now, the kind of quiet that felt less lonely and more sacred. A space, waiting to be honored, not mourned. I didn't rush to change anything. I didn't box up memories or tear down wallpaper just to make my mark. Instead, I moved through the house slowly, touching things gently, learning the shape of the life my mother had built around herself, the parts of it she had never shown, the rest of the world. In her bedroom, tucked into the back of a drawer, I found another small note. Just a scrap of paper, really. It wasn't even signed. It simply said, "Strength isn't loud, Claire. It's patient, it's steady, and it's yours." I sat down on the bed, the paper crinkling softly in my hands, and let the weight of it settle in my chest. I hadn't needed her approval to survive, but there was something deeply healing in knowing that, behind the scenes, she had seen me. Not as an afterthought or an obligation, but as something whole and real in my own right. There were moments, of course, when the sadness crept in. Birthdays passed with no invitations. Family gatherings came and went, pictures posted online, smiles frozen in digital frames. I was never asked to join. There were moments when I caught myself wondering, if I had fought harder, if I had begged louder, would things have been different? But then I would walk into the living room, where sunlight poured through the windows she had loved so much, and I would remember I hadn't lost anything I truly needed, and I had gained something. No bitterness could take away peace. The cycles of favoritism, of silent competition, of love doled out like prizes to be won, they ended with me. I didn't need to play that game anymore. I didn't need to prove anything to people who had already decided not to see me. Instead, I chose something quieter, something harder but infinitely more powerful. I chose peace. I planted new flowers in the garden, but kept her rose bushes intact. I repainted the study but left her collection of poetry untouched on the shelves. I made room for myself here, not by erasing her, but by growing alongside the memory of her. In the evenings, I would sometimes sit on the front porch with a cup of tea, listening to the cicadas hum and the soft rustle of leaves overhead. The world didn't owe me anything. It never had. And yet somehow, in choosing to live without resentment, I found that the world offered small, unexpected mercies anyway. A neighbor who brought over a basket of late summer peaches. A bookstore clerk who remembered my name. A stranger who smiled as we passed each other on the sidewalk. Tiny affirmations that life could be built on different foundations if you chose carefully enough. I thought of my mother often. Not with anger, not with longing, but with a soft, measured gratitude. She had loved me in the ways she knew how. And in the end, she had found a way to tell me. That was enough. I wasn't alone. I'd never been. And I didn't need anyone's permission to claim my own story, my own life, as something worth treasuring. As autumn settled in and the trees around Willow Lane flared into color, I found myself thinking less about what I had lost and more about what I had chosen. I had chosen dignity over bitterness, integrity over resentment, grace over the endless hunger for approval. And in doing so, I realized, without fanfare or applause, that I had given myself the thing I had once so desperately wanted from others: validation, belonging, home, not handed to me by anyone else, not dependent on their acceptance or understanding, but rooted quietly and irrevocably in myself. I sipped my tea, tucked a blanket tighter around my shoulders, and watched the golden leaves dance across the front lawn. The house stood steady behind me. My mother's memory rested gently within it, and my life, my real life, stretched forward, wide and open and entirely my own.